Claire, I have to tell you, I think it's a really good idea doing these sort of in-between Q&A sessions. One, we never get to enough questions during the webinar itself, and that's my fault. That's what I get for being long-winded. But also, since we're doing these once a month now, it's a good way to keep the conversation going over the course of the month. So I know we've picked out some questions from last week's webinar. Maybe we can dig a little bit deeper than we had a chance to last Tuesday. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. We've picked a few questions, tried to consolidate a few to hit on some key themes and topics that we weren't able to answer in last month's program, or just elaborate on some of the themes that we talked about. So with that, I'll dive right into our first very smart, very interesting question. This person asks, Dan, we've talked many times in the past about the debate over human rights in China. Now that the Winter Olympics are underway, how do you see that debate playing out?
Well, yeah, as you know, Claire, our most recent webinar was called, the U.S. in a post-Cold War world. And although we talked a little bit about China, we spent most of our time on Russia. So I'm glad we're getting the chance to revisit this a little bit. Yeah, there was a lot of expectation heading into these Winter Games that the Chinese government would be put on the defensive over international unhappiness and anger with the way they've handled human rights in Northwest China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and elsewhere. And while the US and some of its allies have imposed a diplomatic boycott of the Games that is still allowing the athletes to compete but not sending high-ranking government officials, it looks like the Games are going off, at least so far, without a great deal of disruption. What's notable is NBC, in their coverage of the Olympics, really did devote a lot more time to political discussion, specifically on human rights, as is normally the case. But otherwise, now that that's taken place, unless we see, I think, a high-profile athlete protesting at some point during a medal ceremony or a competition, it looks like the Chinese leadership will have gotten what they want to out of these Games. They have faced some harsh criticism. Any number of people comparing these Olympics to the 1936 Summer Games in Berlin, in which Hitler and the Nazis attempted to put on a good face for the world before the onset of World War II. But generally speaking, I feel like those who've been criticizing China of their treatment of the Uyghurs and others over the years have gotten a somewhat heightened platform, but for the most part, again, at least so far, the Games are coming off pretty well. The Chinese government would want them to.
Very interesting. Thank you. All right, Dan, our next question is, with respect to Russia, did the US in the 1990s make a mistake similar to the one the victorious powers made in Versailles after World War I? Maybe we shouldn't have expanded NATO, maybe even disbanded it. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't know about disbanding NATO, because the time immediately following the dissolution of the Soviet Union was such a volatile time in world history that I feel like absolutely eliminating the organization might have been somewhat of an overreaction. But it is clear that since the early 1990s, NATO has been an alliance to a large degree in search of a mission. And while it has involved itself in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, ironically, it really isn't until this current flare-up that NATO's original role has become extremely vital on the world stage. Did the US and its allies make a mistake by expanding NATO so aggressively toward Russia and allowing so many of the former Soviet client states to join? Well, that's a matter of debate. On one hand, there's no question that Putin and his allies and his advisors in Russia believe very strongly that that was an abject humiliation to the Russian people, not just that the Soviet Union had collapsed, but that so many of its members were joining the West. And a lot of smart thinkers warned the Clinton administration in the 1990s that perhaps NATO should be somewhat more careful and cautious and circumspect in expansion so as to avoid inflaming the Russians. It's been reported, and there's no reliable source on this, it's been reported that James Baker, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, promised the Russians that NATO would not expand into the former Soviet Union. Baker says he doesn't say that. Putin says he did. We'll never know. And so there is something to be said, because it's clear that that humiliation fuels a lot of Putin's anger and motivation for a lot of his actions on the world stage. But that said, to be fair, in every single Eastern Bloc state that joined NATO, the people of those countries were overwhelmingly in favor of it. So the question, just as hard to resolve now 30 years later, is do you honor the wishes of those people by moving more aggressively, or do you proceed with a bit more caution in order to avoid the kind of situation in which we now find ourselves? My own feeling is that if it wasn't for NATO expansion, Putin would be looking for another reason to try to reassert himself on the world stage. But it is clear that because NATO expanded so quickly and so aggressively, that has given him a rationale for doing so.
Thank you, Dan. So let's continue the conversation a bit now on US domestic politics. We have not talked about the midterm elections for a while. So Dan, why don't you share a few of your thoughts on what you see happening in this year's 2022 midterm elections?
Yeah, so you're right. We did talk about this a little bit last month, but as you know, Claire, a month in American politics, particularly during an election year, is a pretty long time. And what seemed to be the case at the beginning of 2022, where it appeared that Republicans had a very, very strong advantage in the fight for Congress, and it looked like they would be heavily favored to regain their majorities in both the House and the Senate. That's now somewhat in question. You still have to consider Republicans the odds-on favorite to regain those majorities in both chambers. One, because history demonstrates that the president's party almost always loses seats in that president's first midterm. And the number of Democratic retirements, almost 30 Democratic House members have retired, suggests a party that knows it's on its heels. But it did appear for most of last year, for most of the second half of last year and the first weeks of 2022, that Republicans would also achieve an immense gain in the way redistricting is accomplished. Because Republicans control so many more state legislatures around the country, it looked like they'd be able to draw lines to their advantage. And here we are. We still have a ways to go before all the congressional lines, or the new congressional lines around the country, are drawn. It looks like Democrats have done much better than had been expected. And while it appeared just a couple of months ago that Republicans would gain several seats just by the way the new districts were drawn, it now looks like that plays to the Democrats' advantage. One, because the Democratic-controlled legislatures in states like New York and Illinois and Maryland are being much more aggressive in their line drawing. Second, because the districts drawn by Republicans in many states are now being challenged in the courts. But also interesting is Democrats are taking a risk here by drawing districts that are only narrowly Democratic. They're increasing their potential chances of gaining those seats. But because the margins between the two parties are so close, there's no guarantee there. On the other hand, the reason Republicans haven't gained more seats in the lines they've drawn so far is rather than trying to create new districts for themselves, they're trying to make the Republican districts that already exist even safer for incumbents. So history is still on the side of Republicans, but this is much more an open question now than it would have been even a month or so ago.
Very interesting. Well, I'm sure we'll be tracking the developments, particularly with these midterms, over the next months as they continue to develop. And I'm really excited to have your analysis to guide us through this election cycle year. So thank you for that.
No, and I'm really glad we get to add this feature. And I know you feel the same way, Claire. I hope that the loyal audience members we have who watch the webinars themselves will watch these too and send us their thoughts. And so we can keep the conversation going over the course of the month until we gather again at the beginning of March for our next webinar.
Yes, exactly. So join us next month, March 1st, Tuesday at 5 p.m. PST for a live recording of the Dan Schnur Political Report. And in the meantime, we hope that you enjoy continuing the conversation. So thank you so much, Dan.
Great to see you, Claire. I'll talk again soon. Good day, everybody.